Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to Wisteria Cottage, the live studios here, just next to Folkestone, in between here and Canterbury, in Kent, UK. We're sitting with the traveling book distributors, Lord Chaitanya's Orange Berets, the special forces that are going out and doing undercover work to deliver the fallen souls on behalf of Lord Chaitanya, giving out Srila Prabhupada's books, which we're reading. And I must say I was very impressed with their reflections and questions yesterday. I'm looking forward to more of the same. Hare Krishna. Welcome to all of you out there in cyberspace. And don't forget to share. Caring means sharing. And let's hear Srila Sanatana Goswami's beautiful glorification, deep philosophical understanding of what the Srimad-Bhagavatam is. It's the Srimad-Bhagavata Mahima Stotram. It goes like this. Sarva Shastrabdi Piyusha Sarva Vedaika Satpala Sarva Siddhanta Ratnaja Sarva Lokaika Drikprada. Oh, nectar. We got to turn this off. Oh, nectar from the ocean of all scriptures, singular fruit of all the Vedas. Thank you. Rich mine of the precious gems of conclusive truths. You are the only giver of sight to all the world. Sarva Bhagavata Prana Srimad Bhagavata Prabhu Kalidwan Ditya Shri Krishna Parivartita. O life air of all the Supreme Lord's devotees, O Master Srimad Bhagavatam, you are the sun risen in the darkness of Kali. You are the exact image of Sri Krishna. Paramananda Pataya Prema Varshakshadayate Sarvada Sarvasevyaya Shri Krishnaya Namostume. I bow down to you who are supremely blissful to read. Your every syllable pours down a flood of prema. You can always be served by everyone. You are Sri Krishna himself. Madeka Bando Matsangin Madguro Man Mahadana Man Nishtadaga Madbhagya Madanandana Mostute. You two can sit here. Sit here. My only friend, my constant companion, my spiritual master, my great wealth, my savior, my good fortune, my source of ecstasy. I bow down to you. Asadu, saduta dayin, Atini chotata kada Hanamun chagadachin mam premna ritnatayospura. O bestower of saintliness to the unsaintly, O exalter of the most fallen. No excuses. Oh, but I'm the most fallen. Never mind. O exalter of the most fallen, please never leave me. Always appear in my heart and my voice with pure love. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Power, Sankirtan devotees. Okay, we're coming to the last part of the 10th chapter, the end of the second canto, and Shukadeva Goswami is describing what happened after Krishna enlightened Brahma with the Chaturshloki, the first 4 verses, or the seed verses rather, of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. You know, Lord Brahma gets all the Vedas, and the Vedas are eternal sound. It's eternal sound, which actually describes how to recreate the universe and maintain it. So once he gets this sound, then he understands what to do, and he starts to create the universe. And that's what we're hearing now. We're hearing the beginning of the universe. And the first phase of the creation, in the first phase of the creation, Lord Mahavishnu produces or manifests the material energy as a cloud in the spiritual sky, and then he injects the souls, injects time, and starts the process. All the souls that come into the material world from the previous creation carry with them their subtle bodies with the unfulfilled desires, the karmic reactions from their previous creation. And therefore, within the body of the Lord, those unfulfilled desires agitate the Lord and cause him to want to create, to fulfill their desires. Just like a father wants to fulfill the desires of his children. So then all the different parts of the body are created subtly in the sarga, in the beginning phase of creation. So they're not being manifested within the universal shells of the universes. That there's a process that we read about it yesterday. We talked about it yesterday. So now we are in each universe, the Lord manifests himself as the universal form. And Lord Brahma is, these parts of the universe that are already there within the stem of the lotus, they come from the body of the Lord through the stem of the lotus into the lotus flower, and they're all there in that lotus flower, and that expands that lotus flower throughout the universe. And then Lord Brahma engineers it, and all the different forms and all the different species of life and all the different... But first of all, the universal form has to become activated. And that's what we're going to hear about now. How the external body of the Lord, the universal form, is activated. Beginning with text 17, 10th chapter, 2nd canto. The living force, being agitated by the Virat Purusha, generated hunger and thirst. And when he desired to drink and eat, the mouth opened. Purport. The process by which all living beings in the womb of the mother develop their sense organs and sense perceptions appears to follow the same principles in the case of the Virat Purusha, the sum total of all living entities. Therefore, the supreme cause of all generation is not impersonal or without desire. The desires for all kinds of sense perception and sense organs exist in the Supreme, and thus they take place in the individual persons. This desire is the nature of the Supreme living being, the Absolute Truth. Because he has a sum total of all mouths, the individual living entities have mouths. Similarly, with all other senses and sense organs, here the mouth is the symbolic representation of all sense organs. For the same principles apply to the others also. Text 18. From the mouth the palate became manifested, and thereupon the tongue was also generated. After this, all the different tastes came into existence, so that the tongue can relish them. Purport. This gradual process of evolution suggests the explanation of the controlling deities, Adidaiva, in this case Varuna. The mouth becomes the resting place for the tongue, which tastes all the different relishable juices, of which the controlling deity is Varuna. This suggests, therefore, that Varuna was also generated with the development of the tongue. The tongue and the palate are being instrumental, are adibhutam, or forces of matter. But the functioning deity, who is a living entity, is adidaiva, whereas the person undergoing the function is adhyatma. Thus the three categories are also explained as to their birth after the opening of the mouth of the Virat Purusha. The four principles mentioned in this verse serve to explain the three main principles, namely the adhyatma, adidaiva, and adibhutam, as explained before. Text 19. When the Supreme desired to speak, speeches were vibrated from the mouth. Then the controlling deity fire was generated from the mouth. But when the Supreme was lying in the water, all these functions remained suspended. Purport. The peculiarity of the gradual development of the different senses is simultaneously supported by their controlling deities. It is to be understood, therefore, that the activities of the sense organs are controlled by the will of the Supreme. The senses are, so to speak, offering a license for the conditioned souls, who are to use them properly under the control of the controlling deity deputed by the Supreme Lord. One who violates such controlling regulations has to be punished by degradation to a lower status of life. Consider, for example, the tongue and its controlling deity, Varuna. The tongue is meant for eating, and men, animals, and birds each have their different tastes because of different licenses. The taste of human beings and that of the swine are not of the same level. The controlling deity, however, awards or certifies a particular type of body when the particular living entity develops a taste in terms of different modes of nature. If the human being develops taste without discrimination, as does the swine, then the controlling deity is certainly certified for the next term to award him the body of a swine. The swine accepts any kind of foodstuff, including stools, and the human being who has developed such indiscriminate taste must be prepared for a degraded life in the next life. Such a life is also God's grace, because the conditioned soul desired a body like that for perfectly tasting a particular type of foodstuff. If a man gets the body of a swine, it must be considered the grace of the Lord, because the Lord awards the facility. After death, the next body is offered by superior control, not blindly. A human being, therefore, must be on his guard as to what sort of body he is going to have in the next life. An irresponsible life of indiscrimination is risky, and that is the declaration of all scriptures. Text 20. Thereupon, when the Supreme Purusha desired to smell odors, the nostrils and respiration were generated, the nasal instrument and odors came into existence, and the controlling deity of air carrying smell also became manifested. Purport. The nasal instrument, odor, and the controlling deity of air, smelling, etc., all became manifested simultaneously when the Lord desired to smell. The Vedic mantras confirm this statement of the Upanishad statement that everything is first desired by the Supreme before the subordinate living entity can act upon it. The living entity can see only when the Lord sees. The living entity can smell when the Lord smells, and so on. The idea is that the living entity cannot do anything independently. He can simply think of doing something independently, but he cannot act independently. This independence in thinking is there by the grace of the Lord, but the thinking can be given shape only by the grace of the Lord, and therefore the common saying is that man proposes and God disposes. The whole explanation is on the subject of the absolute dependence of the living entities and the absolute independence of the Supreme Lord. Less intelligent persons claiming to be on an equal level with God must first prove themselves to be absolute and independent, and then they must substantiate their claim to being one with God. 21. Thus, when everything existed in darkness, the Lord desired to see himself in all that was created. Then the eyes, the illuminating sun, God's Son, the power of vision, and the object of sight all became manifested. Purport. The universe is by nature dense darkness, and therefore the total creation is called tamas, or darkness. The night is the real feature of the universe, for then one cannot see, including oneself. The Lord, out of his causeless mercy, first desired to see himself in all the creation as well, and thus the sun became manifested. The power of vision for all living entities became possible, and the objects of vision were also manifested. This means that the whole phenomenal world became visible after the creation of the sun. Text 22. By development of the desire of the great sages to know, the ears, the power of hearing, the controlling deity of hearing, and the objects of hearing became manifested. The great sages desired to hear about the self. Purport. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita, by advancement of knowledge one should try to know about the Supreme Lord, the summum bonum of everything. Knowledge does not mean knowledge only of the laws of nature or physical knowledge, which are working by the direction of the Lord. The scientists are eager to hear about the physical laws working in material nature. They are eager to hear through the medium of radio and television about things taking place far away from them on other planets, but they should know that the power of hearing and the instruments for hearing were given to them by the Lord for hearing about the self or about the Lord. Unfortunately, the power of hearing is misused in hearing the vibrations of mundane affairs. The great sages were interested in hearing about the Lord through Vedic knowledge and nothing more. That is the beginning of oral reception of knowledge. 23. When there was a desire to perceive the physical characteristics of matter, such as softness, hardness, warmth, coldness, lightness, and heaviness, the background of the touch sensation was generated, namely the skin pores, and the bodily hairs, along with their controlling deities, the trees. Within and outside the skin, there are a covering of air through which the touch sensation became prominent. Purport. The physical characteristics of matter, such as softness, are subjects of sense perception, and thus physical knowledge is the subject matter of touch sensation. One can measure the temperature of matter by touching with the hand, and one can measure the weight of an object by lifting it with the hand, and thus estimate its heaviness or lightness. The skin pores, and the hairs in the body are all interdependent with the touch sensation. The air blowing within and outside the skin is also an object of sense perception. This sense perception is also a source of knowledge, and therefore it is suggested here that the physical or physiological knowledge is subordinate to the knowledge of the self, as above mentioned. Knowledge of the self can expand to the knowledge of phenomena, but physical knowledge cannot lead to knowledge of the self. There is, however, an intimate relation between the hairs on the body and the vegetation on the body of the earth. The vegetables are nourishment for the skin, both as food and medicine, as stated in the third canto, Tocham, Asya, Vinyabhinam, Vishushur, Jishnyam Oshadhihi. 24. Thereafter, when the Supreme Person desired to perform varieties of work, the two hands and their controlling strength, and Indra, the demigod in heaven, became manifested, as also the acts dependent on both the hands and the demigods. Purport. In every item we can note with profit that the sense organs of a living entity are never independent at any stage. The Lord is known as the Lord of the senses, Rishikesha. Thus, the sense organs of the living entities are manifested by the will of the Lord, and each organ is controlled by a certain type of demigod. No one, therefore, can claim any proprietorship of the senses. The living entity is controlled by the senses. The senses are controlled by the demigods, and the demigods are the servant of the Supreme Lord. That is the arrangement in the system of creation. The whole thing is controlled ultimately by the Supreme Lord, and there is no independence of either the material nature or the living entity. The illusioned living entity, who claims to be the Lord of his senses, is under the clutches of the external energy of the Lord. As long as the living entity continues to be puffed up by his tiny existence, he has to be understood to be under the stringent control of the external energy of the Lord. And there is no question of liberation from the clutches of illusion, Maya, however much one may declare himself a liberated soul. Text 25. Thereupon, because of his desiring to control movement, his legs became manifested. And from the legs, the controlling deity named Vishnu was generated. By his personal supervision of this act, all varieties of human being are busily engaged in dutiful occupational sacrifice. This Vishnu, by the way, is a demigod. It's not the actual original Vishnu. Purport. Every human being is engaged in his particular occupational duty, and such activities are visible as men go hither and thither. This is very prominently visible in big cities of the world. People are going all over the cities with great concern from one place to another. This movement is not limited only to the cities, but also visible outside the cities, from one place to another, or from one city to another, by different vehicles. Men are moving by cars and trains on the surface, by subways within the earth, and by planes in the sky, for the purpose of business success. In all these movements, the real purpose is to earn wealth for comfortable life. For this comfortable life, the scientist is engaged, the artist is engaged, the engineer is engaged, the technician is engaged, all in different branches of human activity. But they do not know how to make the activities purposeful to fulfill the mission of human life. Because they do not know this secret, all their activities are targeted towards the goal of sense gratification without control. And therefore, by all this business, they are unknowingly entering into the deep regions of darkness. Because they have been captivated by the external energy of the Supreme Lord, they have completely forgotten the Supreme Lord Vishnu. And thus they have taken it for granted that this life, as presently manifested under the conditions of material nature, is all in all for enjoying the highest amount of sense gratification. But such a wrong conception of life cannot give anyone the desired peace of mind. And thus, in spite of all advancement in knowledge, by use of the resources of nature, no one is happy in this material civilization. The secret is that at every step they should try to execute sacrifices toward the path of world peace. The Bhagavad Gita also advises the same secret in the following verses. Sway sway, karmanyabhiratat, sangsiddhim labate naraha, swakarma niratak siddhim, yata vindati tachtrinu, yatak pravrti bhutanam, inasarvamidam tatam, swakarmana tam abhyarcha, siddhim vindati manavaha. The Lord said to Arjuna, just hear from me how one can attain the highest perfection of in life simply by discharging his specified occupational duty. Man can attain the highest perfection of life by worshipping the Supreme Lord and by performing sacrifice for the sake of the Supreme Lord Vishnu, who is all-pervading and by whose control every living being acquires his desired facilities according to his personal propensity. There is no harm in having different propensities in life, because every human being is proportionately independent to chalk out the plan of his life by different occupations. But one should make it a point in his life to know perfectly well that he is not independent absolutely. One is certainly under the control of the Supreme Lord and under different agencies. Knowing this, one should make it a point that by his work and the result of his labor, he serves the Supreme Lord as prescribed by the authorities expert in the transcendental loving service of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. For performing such occupational duties of life, the leg is the most important instrument of the body, because without the help of the legs, one cannot move from one place to another. And therefore the Lord has special control over the legs of all human beings, which are meant for performing yagyas. Text 26. Thereupon, for sexual pleasure, begetting offspring, and tasting heavenly nectar, the Lord developed genitals. And thus there is the genital organ and its controlling deity, the Prajapati, sexual pleasure and its controlling deity under the control of the genitals of the Lord. Purport. The heavenly pleasure of the conditioned soul is sexual pleasure, and this pleasure is tasted by the genitals. The woman is the object of sexual pleasure, and both the sense perception of sexual pleasure and the woman are controlled by the Prajapati, who is under the control of the Lord's genitals. The impersonalist must know from this verse that the Lord is not impersonal, for he has his genitals, on which all the pleasurable objects of sex depend. No one would have taken the trouble to maintain children if there were no taste of heavenly nectar by the means of sexual intercourse. This material world is created to give the conditioned souls a chance for rejuvenation, for going back home, back to Godhead, and therefore generation of the living being is necessary for the upkeep of the purpose of creation. Sexual pleasure is an impetus for such action, and as such, one can even serve the Lord in the act of such sexual pleasure. The service is counted when the children born by such sexual pleasure are properly trained in God consciousness. The whole idea of material creation is to revive the dormant God consciousness of a living entity. In forms of life other than the human form, sexual pleasure is prominent without any motive of service for the mission of the Lord. But in the human form of life, the conditioned soul can render service to the Lord by creating progeny suitable for the attainment of salvation. One can beget hundreds of children to enjoy the celestial pleasure of sexual intercourse, provided he is able to train the children in God consciousness. Otherwise, begetting children is on the level of the swine. Rather, the swine is more expert than the human being, because the swine can beget a dozen piglets at a time, whereas the human being can give birth only to one at a time. So one should always remember that the genitals, sexual pleasure, the woman, and the offspring are all related in the service of the Lord. And one who forgets this relationship in the service of the Supreme Lord becomes subjected to the threefold miseries of material existence by the laws of nature. Perception of sexual pleasure is there even in the body of a dog, but there is no sense of God consciousness. The human form of life is distinct from that of the dog by the perception of God consciousness. So everything's discussed in the Bhagavatam, threadbare. Text 27. Thereafter, when he desired to evacuate the refuse of eatables, the evacuating hole, anus, and the sensory organ thereof, developed along with the controlling deity, Mitra. The sensory organ and the evacuating substance are both under the shelter of the controlling deity. Purport. Even in the matter of evacuating stool, the refuse is controlled. So how can the living entity claim to be independent? No, I don't want to go to that. No. Text 28. Thereafter, when he desired to move from one body to another, the navel and the air of departure and death were combinedly created. The navel is the shelter for both, namely death and the separating force. Purport. The pranavayu continues the life, and the apanavayu stops the living force. Both the vibrations are generated from the abdominal hole, the navel. This navel is the joint from one body to the other. Lord Brahma was born of the abdominal hole of Garbhodakashayi Vishnu as a separate body, and the same principle is followed even in the birth of an ordinary body. The body of the child develops from the body of the mother, and when the child is separated from the body of the mother, it is separated by cutting the navel joint. And that is the way the Supreme Lord manifested himself as separated many. The living entities are therefore separated parts, and thus they have no independence. Text 29. When there was a desire to have food and drink, the abdomen and the intestines and also the arteries became manifested. The rivers and seas are the source of their sustenance and metabolism. Purport. The controlling deities of the intestines are the rivers, and those of the arteries, the seas. Filling the belly with food and drink is the cause of sustenance, and metabolizing the food and drink replenishes the bodily energies. Therefore, the body's health is dependent on healthy actions of the intestines and the arteries. The rivers and the seas, being the controlling deities of the two, keep the intestines and the arteries in healthy order. Text 30. When there was a desire to think about the activities of his own energy, then the heart, the seat of the mind, the moon, determination, and all desire became manifested. Purport. The heart of every living entity is the seat of the Supersoul, Paramatma, a plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Without his presence, the living entity cannot get into the working energy according to his past deeds. The living entities who are conditioned in the material world are manifested in the creation in terms of respective inclinations inherent in them, and the requisite material body is offered to each and every one of them by the material energy under the direction of the Supersoul.